In this video, I'll do my version of the week 12 assignment where I'm making a tiled pattern from code in P5.js. So you have lots of options for what kinds of pattern you want to make. I'm going to be working with some images that I first create in Illustrator, then bring into the code to arrange in a semi-random but still somewhat ordered pattern. So in Illustrator, I'm going to make myself a new file, and I'll make this 50 pixels by 50 pixels using RGB color and high raster effects. I'll go ahead and click Create. And to get this set up, I'll go to my View menu, and let's make sure my rulers are turned on. I also want to make sure Smart Guides are enabled, and Snap to Pixel is enabled as well. So from the top ruler, I'll click and drag down to the center of the canvas, and same thing from the left-hand side. So this is going to help me to line up two arc shapes, which will allow me to tile this pattern in a sequence that will look pretty interesting. So to get my arcs, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the ellipse tool, then hold down Alt or Option on the keyboard while snapping to the top left corner. Now single click and set an ellipse that's 50 pixels wide and 50 pixels high. And with that shape selected, I'll go ahead and click on the default fill and stroke colors. Let's give this a wider stroke. Let's say something like 6 should be pretty good. Now I'd like to duplicate that same shape across the diagonal. So I'd like it to start here, arc down to here. So I'll just go ahead and copy paste my existing shape and just drag this down, snapping right to that lower right corner. As a last step, I'll bring up my rectangle tool and just click and drag, snapping to the corners of my artboard. Then I'll select All from the menu bar, and under the Object menu, I'll click Clipping Mask Make. So I've got the start of a pattern here that when I rotate it and place duplicates next to one another will create some really interesting undulating patterns. So I need to make one rotation of this artboard. So I'll go ahead and click on the Artboards panel, make an additional artboard, and then I can just select the shape I already have and copy paste to the other artboard. And then I just need to rotate this second artboard 90 degrees. And here you can start to get a little preview of how these will line up with one another. So now let's save these out as pixel image files. So I'll click on File, Export, Export As. I'll save these as PNG files, and I'll make sure to check this Use Artboards checkbox and export all of my artboards. And I'll title these tile.png. Go ahead and click Export. Set my resolution to screen, set my anti-aliasing to art optimized, and my background color to white. So now I can go ahead and click OK, and you can see I've got my two separate images. From there, let's jump into P5. You can see here I've got our version of the nested loops demo. And what I'd like to do basically is replace each one of the circles that's being drawn here with one of these tile images. So let's go ahead and get some variables set up. I'll make one each for tile 1 and tile 2. And then before I initialize them with load image, I actually need to make a folder in my sketch files. I'll call this tiles and upload both of those images to that folder. Okay, back to sketch.js, and I'll use my load image function, starting with that folder name, then the file name for each image. Okay, so I've got my images loaded into their variables. Now, down in my nested loops, I need to make some adjustments to the spacing here for each of my x and y variables. I'd actually like each of these to start at 0, and we'll be increasing by 50, and that's to match up with the 50 pixel width and height for each of my tile images. And for each cell of the grid, rather than drawing an ellipse, we'll be using the image function to draw one of our tiles at the XY location that we're generating with those loops. So you can see how just by laying that tile 1 image next to its neighbors in a grid, we get this sort of undulating wavy pattern. Now, what I'd like to do is introduce some variation so that sometimes we're drawing tile 1, other times we're drawing tile 2. And so to start, I'd like to just decide that randomly. So let's go ahead and make a local variable, and I'll initialize this with the random function, and I'll give it a range of 10, so that gives us a random number from 0 up to 10. From there, I can use a conditional to say if that random variable is less than 5, draw tile 1. If it's greater than 5, draw tile 2. Now I can see I'm getting this really rapid fire flickering here, and that's because since I've declared this as a local variable, that random number is getting updated every single time the draw loop repeats. So let's actually select that, and I'm going to cut it and paste it up here to the top. Because I'm using a function to initialize this variable, I need to separate my declaration and my initialization into 2 steps. So I'm just going to be doing the declaration part here outside of my setup block, and then within setup, I'll do the initialization where I pick a random number to set that to. Now I can see that sort of fixed my flickering problem, but what's happening here is that this random number is only getting picked once at the beginning of the program. And what I'm looking for is actually a mix of sometimes that variable being less than 5, sometimes greater than 5, but when I only set it once in setup, I'll just get one or the other. So I think I'm going to Command Z here and backtrack a little bit. And what we can do is, down at the bottom of our draw loop, let's add a command called no loop. So what this does is essentially pauses the processing of P5 at the end of that draw loop. And we can turn it back on with the loop function. Now this should take us right back to our flickering mode. And that's okay because we can take that loop and maybe we can put it into a function mouse pressed. So now when I click the mouse, I'll basically send the end of that draw block back up to start. So in a sense, I can manually advance the processing of that draw loop. And so here, every time I click, I'm getting different arrangements of those 2 tiling patterns. And because of the way I made them in Illustrator, so you can see here in the top, both of those arcs meet the edge at the exact same place. Same thing on each of the other sides. So that's the key to getting this sort of repetition. This is something called a Truchet tile, and it's pretty well known in math and geometry and computer science for making this kind of interesting pattern. So again, that's one option that we could work with for this week's assignment. Now, of course, there's many other variations on ways that you could make patterns in P5. Some of those are outlined in the assignment description. Some of those are also referenced in the link to this week's demo files, where I've included some previous examples of student work who have approached this differently. So don't feel like this is exactly what you have to do. This is just one option.